I thought it would be nice if we started with something quick and easy and simple, like God. In particular, I don't believe there is one, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it.
You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?
I mean just about the subject in general, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on about what I don't think as well, maybe.
Well, it's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a fair bit of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate. And that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of an evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that's a start, I guess.
Except, and so you have to bear with me,
Yeah,
because I'm from Texas.
that's okay. I'm from Alberta, you know. It's bigger than Texas, just as bad.
Yeah. So the curious thing for me is all of that applies, seemingly, if I'm understanding it, to religious thought, religious tradition, the value of religious identity to individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not there is a God or whether or not there's sufficient reason to believe there's a God, which is my sticking point. I'm fully fine with the idea, we'll try and get through this without, like, raucous applause, but, hey, at least I got one.
Yeah, you don't never complain about raucous applause.
Because that's the sticking point for me. I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality, that they can be inspired and motivated, educated, and enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But my concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Well, it's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. So I think that distinction can be made, but it's a lot more difficult than people generally think. And I also think that there's no doubt that there are different levels of sophistication of religious belief. What I see happening in this sort of discussion, say frequently, and again, like I said, I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. I see most of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly of the American persuasion, who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory, when it clearly doesn't, right? I mean, if you're...
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
yeah.
If you're a religious thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory. And that's just self-evident. First of all, like, when was the first scientist? Descartes, Bacon, Newton? Maybe you could chase it back to the Greeks, but no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists, like, I feel for the fundamentalists, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories. And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart, and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But, well,
what I'd like
they're
is
still worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. Here's an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished. Well, I thought about it a lot, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong, because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong, because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.
And this is what I point out in the lecture on skepticism, since you didn't get to see the show, is that being wrong feels exactly like being right. Nobody runs around going, oh, I'm wrong, but I'm going to keep believing this. We all assume that we are correct about a great many things. And it's not so much that being wrong is the thing we're afraid of. I think that being exposed as wrong is the thing we're afraid of.
We're also sometimes afraid of being wrong, because if you're wrong at a deep level, it can really hurt you.
Oh, I agree.
It can really take you apart. And so people don't like to be taken apart. Like if you're wrong about your wife, for example, that tends to be a very painful thing. And that's something that's worth pursuing to try to figure out why that is.
That's why I had the frying pan.
That should make you popular. Okay, so one of the issues that I have, and you can respond to this, is that let's say the celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase, they don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues. They seem to be going. What are the real issues? Dostoevsky, he's a real issue. Tolstoy, he's a real issue. Carl Jung, 20 books and maybe 15 seminars, he's a real issue. Mircea Eliade. Like, there are some serious heavy hitters in the religious phenomenology domain. And my sense so far, I just finished reading all of Harris's books, for example, he doesn't contend with them at all. And it's like, for me, that's like being an evolutionary biologist and not being aware of Darwin. It's actually a big problem. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry. He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
I think this gets to basically the same point I was talking about before. The thing that you're objecting to, it seems, is that many of us don't want to address the aspects of religion that you find value in, because we're only focused on, perhaps as I'm talking in the show, from a scientific skepticism perspective of, are there valid and sound arguments that would lead one to conclude that a God exists? My answer to this so far seems to be no. And the apologists, the theologians, they keep presenting the arguments, the teleological arguments, moral arguments, and all these things. They have nothing to do with the phenomenology of religion. They have nothing to do with how this impacts people's lives. This is a question of, is it in fact the case? Is it consistent with reality that there is a God? And is it consistent with reality that there is good reason to believe there's a God? That is where the focus is primarily.
Yeah, and it's usually construed as a scientific issue.
Well, it's not so. I would never construe it as a scientific issue, because science can't confirm the supernatural. I mean, we are blocked until somebody demonstrates a mechanism by which we can explore and confirm the existence of the supernatural, and then confirm that it actually can impact the natural world. We're stuck, which is why science relies on methodological naturalism.
You seem to be able to do it with psychedelic drugs.
You seem to be able to do what with psychedelic drugs? Well,
everybody that takes them under reliable settings generally comes back and and claims the presence of a mystical experience.
Yeah,
and that
but-
seems to be duplicatable and replicable across cultures in labs with multiple different substances, the chemical constituents of which are known very well. It's like it's part of this religious phenomenology. And to me, that's just a set of facts. And we know that people have been using those substances to evoke mystical and religious experiences for, who knows, 150,000 years maybe.
Sure.
We can at least infer that. And we have no idea whatsoever how much of an effect the use of those substances has had on the metaphysical substrate of our culture. Like, so what constitutes scientific data here is by no means clear. Here's an example of this, for example. So,
Well, before the example,
yeah.
as someone who's been high as a kite, I fully agree that people take drugs and report experiences that they describe as mystical or supernatural. Just like people report other experiences as if they were religious or ghosts or whatever. We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without
There
supernatural?
aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one. It's whatever Wellbutrin is.
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation
Sure,
with
but-
one treatment.
but
Yeah,
nothing-
but that's kind of like evidence, you know. It's kind of like evidence.
It's
And
evidence that you can take mushrooms and increase your chance of quitting smoking. But
No, it's not. It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll stop smoking because it doesn't work if you
okay,
don't have
if
the
you take
experience.
mushrooms and you have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something to this notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Well, it's not definitive evidence.
It's
but
not evidence at all.
Oh, sure it is. Oh, sure it is.
No,
How is it? Wait a
That's-
second. Wait a second.
This
That's
is
wrong.
okay.
It is evidence. So, because look,
No, he's
you,
right.
You want to speak.
He's right.
You want to think
I
through
will
this
correct that.
skeptically. Okay, you have a pharmacological substance. It's psilocybin. You give it to people who are trying to quit smoking. The psilocybin doesn't directly have an impact on the smoking behavior. It has to elicit what's described subjectively as a mystical experience. And you can get physiological indicators of that mystical experience. And you might say, well, that's not enough to prove that it's a mystical experience, but you know, you're conscious and I accept that. It's like you accept all sorts of things without being able to demonstrate their validity on every possible objective, with every possible objective criteria. So don't get in too much of a hurry. It's a serious issue. If you give people psilocybin, for example, and they have a mystical experience, not only are they much more likely to quit smoking, which is really something, but they're also much less likely to suffer from death anxiety if they have cancer. Like, that's quite the thing. And not only that, if you test them a year later and they've had a mystical experience, which the majority of them regard as the most significant one, two, or three experiences of their life, including such things as getting married, their personalities are permanently altered in the direction of more openness to experience and more creativity by a standard deviation. Like, that's walloping effects. So we can't get too much in a hurry about dispensing with all that.
Skepticism, as I repeatedly point out in the show, is not about cynicism. It's not about debunking. And I'm not saying that there is no supernatural and that there is no mystical experience. What I'm saying is the thing that people subjectively describe as, I had an incredibly impactful mystical experience, whether it comes from taking a pharmaceutical, whether it comes from attending a revival church service or hearing a particular preacher, whether it comes from having a particularly impressive sexual experience, all of those things, that is the subjective description of that, which may be because of limitations in language, that they don't have any other. This is the language that infuses culture so that we have to use that to describe it. But that doesn't in any way serve to confirm that there is any sort of supernatural realm or any sort of supernatural actor.
Well, it depends on how you define supernatural. Like, look, I get your point.
Okay.
And I'm not claiming that the phenomena of psilocybin intoxication is direct proof for the existence of God. I'm not saying that. I am saying
Although that'd be awesome.
Well, people do report personal experiences of that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's not completely out of the realm of the experience. But it's also because of the problem of the border between the subjective and the objective. It's difficult to probe deeply enough to come up with anything definitive. And I understand that that's a problem. But the supernatural issue, that's a different issue. Like, people are capable of entering different experiential realms where things are qualitatively different to them. The perceptions are different, the thoughts are different, their response to the world is different. They feel that they've died an ego death and transcended their normal mode of perception. Like, maybe that's not part of the supernatural, but then you're starting to define the supernatural pretty narrowly. Like,
No,
do you
it's-
require miracle, like here and now? Something that defies the laws of physics? Or what's your definition of the supernatural?
So there is the natural world,
Yeah.
and then there are people who make claims that something is not part of the natural world, that it has some external supernatural origin. Those are the claims that I don't see how we can make any sort of epistemologically sound confirmation of. I'm fine with accepting that people have these experiences. I was, for many, many years, a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, and I remember standing in church and feeling what I would have described at the time as the Holy Ghost, sweeping through me. Now, many years later, I look back at that and I say, why did I describe this particular experience this way? It's a unique experience. It's of the same quality as something you might experience from a drug, or I've experienced similar things from music and drugs and sex. But they're not all exactly the same. And this is kind of the caveat that the believers, for any one of them, would use is, oh, the thing you're talking about, when you had awesome sex or you were on drugs, that's not the same as what I felt the Holy Spirit. I felt all of them. The reason I would have said at the time that I had been filled with the Holy Spirit is because everybody around me was saying that too. It's not like I have any sort of any way to demonstrate a causal connection between a Holy Spirit and my experience. It was, I had an experience, and I, like everyone else around me, attributed it to the Holy Spirit.
What was the experience like?
Elation, euphoria. I don't think I ever had visions, but certainly it was an overwhelming sensation. You get the goosebumps or hair on your head. And I remember fairly distinctly the first time I had a very similar experience outside of church, because it was from listening to secular music that my church would not have allowed. And then I began to look into things, from far more of a psychological perspective of what type of impact specific music has on people. And a friend of mine, we've had conversations about the cadence of particular preachers, because a Southern Baptist minister will have a different cadence than a Pentecostal preacher, and they'll have a different cadence than somebody else. And I won't put on a performance to do them, but we have this intense curiosity as to, are the successful preachers with those cadence in conjunction with the music, are they just tapping into some sort of psychological impact in our brain in order to make us pliable? In the same way that the elevator experiment, where you have everybody face the back of the elevator, and somebody walks in and they face the doors, and after a while, a lot of them become uncomfortable and turn around and face the back with everybody else for no reason. It's just compliance.
Well, you don't want those backward facers to attack you,
It would be good. But if we're back to back, I think, anyway.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that. Okay, because I think this gets to the heart of some of these issues. So let's say that we can agree that throughout history and before, people were experiencing a set of transcendent emotions that can be evoked by music and dance and other forms of ritual and in a variety of other ways. But there's also a profound proclivity on the part of people, for one reason or another, to attribute those to some sort of supernatural agency.
Yes.
Now, okay, so I want to separate that from another line of thinking. Okay, so let's just leave that aside. So we could think of that as a theory about the origin of religious belief. The experience comes first. It comes along with an implicit hypothesis about supernatural actors behind the scenes eliciting these experiences. Okay, that's in marked distinction to other theories of religious derivation, like Freud's theory, for example, that religion is a defense against death anxiety, or Marx's theory that religion is the opiate of the masses. Right? It's a much more biological theory, the one we're putting forward.
Sure.
Okay, and it seems to me to be a much more credible theory, even though religious movements can be harnessed for economic purposes and for purposes of manipulation and all of that, obviously.
Yeah,
So,
I would think that there's any number of explanations I've heard for the origins of religion, and I find almost all of them plausible in different forms, except for the one that asserts that they come directly from a supernatural being.
well, okay, so that's the one we're going to
Sure.
we're going to pursue, though, because
That was funnier than I thought it was. I was just being honest.
yeah, well, honesty is often funnier than people think it is.
Boy, don't I know.
So people can have these experiences, and they can be evoked in a variety of ways, and people often find them very valuable, at least in terms of their subjective report.
I agree.
And the psilocybin experiments and also the large-scale analysis of psychedelic drug users, by the way, also indicate that the use of such substances is generally associated with an increment in health rather than a decrement, which is quite interesting, right? It's not something you'd necessarily expect. So here's a question. Why in the world do the people who have these experiences have the proclivity to attribute them to supernatural sources, like to a divine source? Like, what's going on there? Why is that the case?
So best guess, and this is contrary. So the skepticism isn't about, hey, let's debunk this and come up with. But if we were going to go through potential plausible explanations, to me this is very similar to in the 40s and 50s when people were supposedly abducted by aliens or ran into aliens. They had descriptions of aliens that pretty much were varied and often matched the various monsters that you saw in the movies then. After 2001, or after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, almost all descriptions of aliens became the almond-headed, this. Mm-hmm. The narrative in the culture about what an alien was
converged.
Yeah. And people were, this is what I experienced. In the same way that people will, sometimes cameras will catch orbs, or a particular lighting effect in a house that is supposedly haunted will be perceived as a ghost, as a spiritual, humanoid form. When we, in some cases, can show that that's actually not the case. In other cases, we have no idea what they necessarily saw. But because what people understand about spirits and souls and ghosts is in the zeitgeist of how we think, it enters the consciousness as a plausible explanation, even if ultimately there's no such thing as ghosts.
But that explains why they converge, but it doesn't explain why the initial impetus is the attribution of the experiences to something supernatural, like to something. See, fair enough.
I'm sure that I'm not convinced that necessarily the natural instinct is to apply it to something supernatural. I think it may be more the case that not only are we pattern recognition machines, but we're the descendants of people who, how you see faces and everything.
Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. That's And
so you see faces, or you anticipate that there's something in the bush out to get you, and when you go and actually investigate and you find there's nothing in the bush out to get you, rather than assuming that you might have been mistaken, maybe it's a spirit.
Yeah, the social psychologists call that the hyperactive agency detector.
And the fact that we can be, before we had a good understanding, we still don't have a good understanding of death and the mind and stuff. But if I'm standing here talking to you and I drop over dead, there's a clear, undeniable difference in me sitting here as an animated being and me laying there as no longer there. And so it seems a natural inference that something that about me has left. That doesn't mean that there's actually something about me, like a soul or whatever, that's left. We don't tend to think the same thing when the radio stops working or the television stops working. It's not like the man in the TV has left. It's just off. But it seems that those sorts of natural...
I don't know if you want to use that analogy, because it suggests that whatever's in the TV is coming from an external source. And you're definitely not making that argument with regards to the soul.
Well, the TV station isn't in my living room, so there's at least some external source sending it to there.
Right, but that's exactly my point.
Yeah, that's all I was going for.
You can make a case that consciousness isn't exactly in your head either, even though it's localized there.
So why would I think consciousness is anywhere other than my head?
Well, how do you account for consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure that we can account for consciousness.
This is definitely true.
But
Yes. See, and
I
that's
have no
another real,
reason to
well,
think
that's
that it's
another,
beyond what the brain produces. The fact that something's mysterious doesn't mean that, well, if something's mysterious,
consciousness isn't just mysterious. It's like really mysterious. It's the most mysterious thing.
Okay, well,
right?
the fact
it's not like ordinary mysterious.
the fact that something is really mysterious to the point where I think you and I would agree that we don't have an explanation for it. Okay, if there was something like that, we'll say that it's maybe consciousness. We agree we don't have an explanation, or at least a complete one for consciousness.
Or even a partial one.
Okay, sure.
Say.
So,
it seems vaguely
so
associated
consciousness
with the
is
brain.
really mysterious, and you and I have no explanation for it. As human beings, we're uncomfortable with saying, I don't know. This is something I'm trying to teach people to become more comfortable with, is to say, I don't know. And so when you ask me about consciousness, my answer is, I don't know. But for other people, they're so uncomfortable with I don't know that they posit an explanation that they cannot justify, something is untestable and unfalsifiable, and that is that there's a ghost in the machine.
Hmm.
I can't make that leap because it is entirely speculation without support. It seems intuitively right because of how we view the world. And yet, I would rather say, I don't know, and then continue to explore it, because I worry that by asserting what the explanation is, you stop looking for the actual explanation.
Okay, so you made the case that part of the reason that we assume beings is because there's a being that seems lacking in death. And that was associated, I had asked the question about why people attribute their mystical experiences to supernatural beings. So we kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it was related. So we could say, well, your idea is something like people personify the soul for obvious reasons, and they also have a hyperactive agency detector, and so it's the combination of whatever mechanisms that produce that
Sure.
allow them to attribute supernatural personification to the source of mystical experiences. It's something like that. Yeah, okay. So let me ask you something. We'll get back to that, maybe.
That's fine.
Let me ask you something about consciousness. You tell me what you think about this.
Okay.
All right, so this is how it looks to me. I mean, there's lots of ways of thinking about how people interact with the world. But I think this is how we treat ourselves and other people as we see them acting in the world. And so I would say it's indicative of our deepest belief, because I think belief is associated with action. So the way consciousness appears to me is that it's a faculty, let's say, that confronts possibility. We'd call that possibility, well, sometimes possibility, sometimes we call it potential, like your potential. Sometimes we call it the future. So I don't see us as driven deterministically like clocks, which is apparently, I think, although I've been accused of misunderstanding Sam Harris before, but I think that's the argument that he makes. I see us instead as agents confronting a landscape of possibility. And that what consciousness does is enable us to shape that possibility into actuality. And we do that with whatever it is that allows us to make decisions. I think that our legal system is basically predicated on the idea that that's true. I think that if you treat yourself that way, that works. I think if you treat other people as if that's their basic characteristic and perhaps their value, that you get along with them. And I think that if you organize your society on that presupposition, it appears to be functional. So what do you think about the idea of consciousness as confronting a landscape of possibility or potential? Is there
Sure.
something?
So I don't know that I have that much of an issue with anything in particular that you've said. There's a number of different ways to frame these things so that people can have a better grasp on it. One of the things I know people struggle with is, and we may have to get back to this in a minute, I don't necessarily want to dig in on it just a second, but I would love to talk about it. This idea that absent a God, there's no moral authority. This is a fear that many people have. And when you're talking about viewing consciousness as the way you describe consciousness is what I would probably call our agency.
Okay.
And while I don't think that we have libertarian free will, I'm on record as being a compatibilist along with Dan Dennett. But I also had another discussion recently, so I'm going to clarify it because of that discussion. I'm fine with the idea that we have a will, that we have desires, that we are an agent that is also capable of self-reflection to see what are the consequences of my action moving forward. To me, it does not matter if that is ultimately deterministic like clockwork, or if there was something that could trump determinism. Oh, I shouldn't have said Trump. I'm so sorry. If there was something that could actually overcome the deterministic view, that doesn't change to me the fact that you would be the agent responsible for your actions. Now, when my lawnmower acts up, I will sometimes anthropomorphically, cuss it out.
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of those vestiges of religious behavior.
But yeah, it is. Touche. I mean, although at least I got rid of them.
I haven't seen you interact with your lawnmower yet.
But at the end, I recognize that the lawnmower is not a thinking agent that is not making decisions. And so that difference between there is where I would inject the sort of ideas about moral responsibility. Sam Harris and I had an argument in Chicago about free will, and I was pointing out that he could walk over and step off the end of the stage, or I could pick him up and carry him and drop him off the stage, and at the end, the effect would essentially be the same. But the conflict between those two is everything that I describe as will, whether you want to call it free or not. I think that's what we value. That's what we care about. I would be responsible for that action. I would be acting in opposition to what the other agent wanted. And I don't know that you have to.
And there would be something hypothetically wrong about that.
Yes.
Okay, good. So that's close.
We can get to the morality thing, because I think the next question I had, unless you wanted to follow up on that, is a lot of, like I was saying earlier, it seems that you're talking a lot about, you haven't addressed the issue, and I'm not going to push back on it because I want to move on to some other stuff.
I'm getting there.
Of whether or not there is good reason to believe there actually is a God, as opposed to whether there are good reasons for people to believe that there actually is a God. Dan Dennett describes, there are people who believe, and then there are people who believe in belief, that there's value. And from what you said here and in some other comments, which I'm not going to saddle you with, I'm curious, irrespective of whether there's a God, what is it that you fear we would lose if people stopped believing that there was a God, or believing there was value in believing there was a God?
We'd lose the metaphoric substrate of our ethos, and we'd be lost.
And so I'm
I think Nietzsche
an
was
uneducated.
right about that.
So I really want to know, and I'm not being a dick. I want to know what you mean by metaphorical substrate, because saying we're going to lose it. So there's the idea. When I ask, what do you think we're going to lose? There's two things. One is there's something that you and I would both agree we should try to keep.
Yeah.
And there are other things that you and I might disagree on whether or not we should keep it. Because when people say to me, if we go down the road with Dostoevsky, that, if there is no God, everything's permissible. First of all, I don't think that's remotely true, because I have...
He makes a pretty vicious case for it, beyond good and evil.
And despite the fact that it sounds monumentally arrogant, I think I can demolish that case in about 2 minutes with his secular morality lecture. Well,
I think the first part of that statement is right, but not the second one.
And we could find out. But the thing is, there would be two categories of things that you and others might be fearful we would lose, some of which I might agree we should definitely not lose these things.
Yeah.
Others I might be absolutely fine with losing.
Like that it's wrong to throw Sam Harris off a stage.
Yeah. I don't plan on doing that, but
well, we
it
both
did
agreed
cross
that
my mind at one point.
We both agreed that was probably wrong.
Yes.
So that's good.
Probably.
Yeah.
See, I'm a situational ethicist, and so there might be situations. If the stage were on fire, throwing Sam off would be the best thing I could do for him. So what do you think? What do you think we're likely to lose? What bothers you? And when you say metaphorical substrate, I'm probably just monumentally ignorant, but I really don't think I have a good understanding of what you mean.
Well, there's levels of thought. I mean, every thought structure, let's say, every belief structure is multi-leveled, like a piece of music. And there's the word in a phrase, and then there's the phrase, and then there's the sentence, and then there's the paragraph, and then there's the sequence of paragraphs within which the paragraphs are uttered, And then there's a broader context of interpretation within which all of that is interpreted. And then there's our emotional and motivational similarity. And then there's our embodiment in the world. And all of those things are operative at all times when we're understanding one another. And as you move outside the realm of the linguistic, like the paragraph level, let's say, into the realm of the emotional and motivational and embodiment and embodied, you also move into the metaphorical. And the metaphorical is structured in a particular way. And this is quite well documented, by the way. I mean, if you look at how the hemispheres interact, so the left hemisphere, broadly speaking, and I'm not oversimplifying this except that we don't have much time, is linguistic. But the linguistic utterances are understood in the context provided more by the right hemisphere, which is nonverbal and which attends to things like the music of language. And so at the bottom of a linguistic structure, there's something that's extra linguistic, and it tends to take form in metaphor and narrative and drama and that sort of thing. And the religious landscape is the narrative, metaphor, drama landscape. And if you disrupt it, then you blow apart the widest possible context within which the specific utterances are rendered comprehensible.
Okay, so I followed all that, shockingly. Anytime you were talking about science and hemispheres and all this other stuff. So when you're talking about the broader context, if we lose belief in a God, we lose that metaphorical substrate that is the broader context in which we evaluate these narratives.
Yeah, that really grinds them into our bodies, that makes them things we believe rather than just think.
Sure, but
see, you didn't
what
just
is it about
think,
the
you
narratives?
didn't just think that it was wrong to throw Sam off the stage.
God, Sam's going to be pissed when he hears that.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Well, so
See, there's a difference between thinking something and believing it, because to believe it, it has to be thought incarnated in some sense. It has to be embodied.
When I talk about it, belief is the state of being convinced that a proposition is true or likely true. It's everything that I try to do, I tend to view in the form of propositional reasoning. So when we talk about the narrative.
Yeah, that's a problem, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you can't reduce the world to a set of propositions.
Why not?
Oh, look.
Show me something that is
No
true
problem.
in the world that is not a proposition. That
Like
you
an
cannot
explicit,
put in the
statable proposition?
something that is demonstrably true that I could not put in a proposition.
Oh, that's easy. You
Okay.
sure you want to go there?
I'm not afraid of anything.
Okay. Okay.
If I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong. But
Yeah.
I'm trying to, for years, I had this thing going where people would say, oh, and this is kind of what we're getting at from a different angle. I would say they would be afraid of what we would lose if we lost religion. And I basically said, demonstrate to me any benefit.
Oh, you'd lose art and poetry and drama and narrative
Why?
and story.
Are there no godless artists and poets?
Well, there are artists and poets who think they're godless.
So we might have crossed over into a problem area because
no doubt.
I can't draw for crap, although I do draw during the show. But one of the individuals who came to the show the other night handed me something that she had spent a great deal of time drawing. She's a wonderful artist. I'm very grateful to get it. And, while I pretend to read minds on stage, I constantly acknowledge that I can't actually read minds. So I can't tell you whether or not she actually believes in a God, but I can tell you that I actually don't believe in a God, and I could write
But you act
poetry.
like you do.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't
I
want to throw
act
poor
like-
Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay, so I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God, and
Yeah.
your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense, but my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God,
Explicitly.
or implicitly.
Maybe.
The f-
That's not so obvious.
Okay, it's really
See, because
it's
you
easy.
regard Sam Harris as an implicitly valuable entity, because otherwise you just throw him off the stage. And then the question is, well, just exactly why is he an implicitly valuable entity?
I don't
What's your
think he's-
metaphysics of that?
I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense, I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense that the universe has implied that there's something explicit about it. For me, morality is far simpler than some people.
No, wait,
make
you
it out
sounded
to be.
doubtful about that. You know that, like
Maybe
you've been
you're the
sounding-
mind
you've
reader.
been- well, maybe.
Because you've already suggested that despite me sitting here and having talked about this for decades, that I don't believe in God, that I actually do because I have a moral code. But my moral code, which I've
Well, I was
talked
more
about,
specific. I said it was because you didn't want to throw Sam off the stage. It
yes,
wasn't
but
just
you
that
didn't.
had a
You didn't
moral code.
You didn't even attempt to ask me why I didn't throw Sam off the stage. Instead, you went to why do you think Sam has implicit value? Because it
Okay,
seems
so,
that in
okay,
your
I'm-
narrative,
I'm willing to
that's
go
the
there.
only justification.
Well, maybe you were afraid of being punished.
I think no.
Oh,
I think
okay.
you can have a perfectly acceptable foundation for secular morality, even if it fundamentally centers around selfishness. I'd rather not be thrown off the stage. It's in my best interest to encourage that sort of understanding in others, and therefore I will not throw him off the stage. I would rather not have my stuff stolen, and it's in my best interest to encourage others not to do that, so I will not steal stuff, and I will work with others to ensure that the people who steal stuff are punished. It is in a virtually pragmatic moral system.
Why do you think it's not in your best interest to have stuff stolen from you or to be thrown off the stage?
Why is it not in my best interest?
Yeah. No, you don't get to think, oh, that's self-evident. It's like nothing's self-evident to the skeptic. Let's keep that in mind.
Oh. Well, so...
Because if we're going to get skeptical here, we might as well go all the way to the bottom.
So for Sam and I, the foundations, and we're not the only ones, but I tend to reference Sam just because if I say this, then somebody will say, well, that's exactly what Sam Harris says, except that, I was given this lecture before he wrote his book. But his book is better than my lecture, so read his book. When I talk about this, I'm talking about well-being is the language that Sam uses.
Oh,
I don't,
yeah.
I don't,
Sad.
I don't care whether or not somebody else considers that morality. I would think at a minimum, would you and I agree that
That whole well-being thing, man, as a basis for a metaphysics, that's just a non-starter.
we're not basing metaphysics on it?
Sam is.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is, because he's out to
Well,
maximize
you
well-being.
can take it up with Sam.
Well, okay, sorry. Do you
Because-
think I'm wrong about that claim? That's what I understood.
I
from
don't
reading
think Sam's
him.
saying anything metaphysical about it. I think so. Here's the thing: we are physical beings.
Well, it's his fundamental claim, so it's sort of at the basis of his ethic. And so he says, well, we should work to maximize people's well-being, or at least to. Well, he does a bit more than that, because he says we should minimize their suffering.
He's not maximize, minimize in this sense of simple consequentialism. Let me do this.
Okay.
We're physical beings in a physical universe, and the laws that dictate how things work in the universe, they are the ultimate arbiters of what is or isn't in our best interest, whether we know it or not. So, for example, so far as I can tell,
Then why do you need free will?
I don't think
Why
we
do you
need
believe
free
in
will.
it then?
I-
Why do you attribute agency to things if the laws of the
Can I
universe can?
get to that one point?
Well, yeah, but there was a contradiction
Because
that was
free
confusing me.
will isn't relevant to this.
It is if the laws of the universe are what are dictating what's good for us.
No, because if you chop off my head, that is clearly not good for me. And it doesn't matter whether it was an act of free will or if it was
It's
my
clearly-
lawnmower.
It's clearly not good for you because you think you're valuable and worth preserving.
Yes.
Okay, that's the issue. Why do you think you're valuable and worth preserving?
Because I am the descendants of people who thought they were valuable and worth preserving, and the ones who didn't think that have killed themselves. But this is not a statement about. This is not a statement about intrinsic value.
I don't know. Yes, I think
No,
it is.
it's-
Okay, but I think it is.
Okay. The reason that we talk about this in terms of well-being is because irrespective of whether or not I care about well-being, there are facts about well-being.
Sure, let's hear them, man. Line those suckers up.
If you chop off my head, it's in contradiction to my well-being. I mean, but the point
No,
of-
I wasn't willing to grant that, actually.
Okay.
I'm saying that's a metaphysical presupposition. You're just saying I have to accept that.
No, I'm not telling you
because
at all what to accept.
Sure you are. You're saying that your
trying
death would be
I'm
wrong.
trying to explain what my position is.
Okay, but you said that wouldn't be in accordance with your well-being. Okay, that's a metaphysical statement or philosophical statement. It's not an obvious fact.
That
That's not
chopping
a
off somebody's
fact.
head is contrary to their well-being.
It depends on how you define well-being.
Sure.
Yeah, but it
But
matters.
if you define well-being as this glass of water, we're no longer talking about the same thing.
Well, you can define well-being. That's fine. That's what I'm waiting for.
This is what I'm. Well,
You can't do it. You can't define well-being. It's
well, then
very,
why
very
should I try? I
difficult.
certainly can't do it if you keep telling me I can't do it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll back off. There's a. Go ahead. I'm all ears.
So, the primary objection to mine and Sam's position that keeps coming back is, why should anybody care about well-being? And we both will acknowledge that this is, in fact, a subjective preference. There are people who are going to care about well-being, there are people who aren't. The second objection is that well-being is not clearly defined. Both of us have acknowledged this. It's not as if we're saying we have all the answers to how to go about living a better life. We're just saying that however we're going to define well-being, which is, I say you can start with a couple of foundations. You could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way. And
Stop
so,
suffering.
well, no, I'm saying you could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way because those
Yeah, you
people-
do. You stop suffering. You just die.
Yes,
Right, so you can start with the presupposition.
except that when you're dead, you're not being, so there's no well-being.
Well, that's.
If
That's
it's
not necessarily the
if
case.
we're looking
because you
for the
could make
best
it-
things about our life, you
Yeah.
can't say death is better.
Yeah, you can.
Well,
People
I
do
know
all
that
the
you can
time.
say it.
People do all the time. They do. No, look.
They
look,
can
I'm
express
not
their
being flippant
preference,
about
but their
this.
preference can be wrong. How can it possibly be better for your life if you're dead?
What if you, like, are a terminal burn victim with cancer?
So this is the point that I was getting to. I am perfectly fine with the idea that for certain instances, there may be occasions that death is preferable to an individual over life. But when we're speaking in broader terms, if we're talking about let's create the best society we can, let's create the best quality of life we can for people, death is not that across the board. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual exceptions. So the foundations that I started with, you could start with death is better than life, but blah, blah, blah. If you start with life is generally preferable to death, health is generally preferable to sickness, happiness is generally preferable to sadness, none of these are absolute locked in stone rules. From those things,
Okay, so if you start with them.
yes, if you
So
start...
you're not skeptical about those claims.
Wow.
Well, I'm asking.
You know,
I'm
I
asking.
came out and said that I wasn't going to be trying to straw man you left and right. And now every time I say something, you're like, oh, so you're not skeptical about that.
Well, I'm trying to.
I haven't
No,
gotten to
sorry. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm trying to understand where your argument begins.
Well, it seems odd that you would come out with, so you're not skeptical about that.
Well, that's a
While
question.
I'm on my skepticism tour, while I'm in mid-sentence to describe that these are the general foundations that you start with.
Okay, that's what I
And-
was asking. Those are okay. So, but what you're saying, if you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm
Okay.
not trying to be difficult. You're saying that those are your starting positions. Those are the things that you accept.
I'm saying they
on
can be.
faith.
No.
Oh, you have a rationale for them.
Yes.
Let's hear it.
You already have. Life is generally preferable to death because we're talking about our life, and death is generally not in the interest of the living. It can be an exception. This is the point that I was getting to. So you could start with those foundations. You could start with any three that you found. You could pick three arbitrary foundations. And the one aspect that makes a secular moral system distinct from religious pronouncements and divine command theory and those sorts of things is that the secular moral system has as its goal the object of getting better at getting better, which means if you find out that one of your foundations is wrong or in conflict with something else, you can now change that. You could start with death as preferable to life, and then when you find out that it's not working that well, you change that foundation. I think that these foundations, based on the evidence of how people tend to live their lives and what they care about, are a good set of three. There could be better ones that somebody come up with. I'm open to revision on any of these at any time. But to say that I'm not skeptical about them is exactly the opposite of what I am. Because skepticism is about, I'm not going to accept something as true without good reason, and it's about being open to revision should there be evidence. If you and I agree that we care about a good life isn't very well defined. And we may have different ideas about what good life is. But if we could actually just sit here and take notes, I think that we'd come across maybe a handful of things that we would agree would make for a good life. If we take those and compare them to the foundations of a secular moral system like what I'm describing, we can determine non-subjectively whether or not the list we've come up with are consistently approachable from that foundation. And we can do that for religious morality as well. The analogy that I've used in the past is, for example, a game of chess. There's nothing about the universe that requires that we care about chess or care about the rules of chess. The rules of chess are arbitrary. Somebody made them up. We changed them. We added en passant. We added castling. We did things like that. We have the rules of chess. We don't always know what the best move is. But if the goal of the game is to win, or at a minimum, not lose, then we can analyze the moves with respect to the consequences and with respect to the goal of winning and determine which moves are better and which moves are worse. That is what a secular moral system does, because it allows revision, whereas religious systems don't allow for revision. There's not a Bible 3.0. There's not a Quran 2.0. There's no new revelation from God to say, hey, I said all this stuff about slavery, now I'm opposed to it. Or, hey, I was really down on homosexuals, but now I'm okay with it. Hey, when I said that here's what caused diseases, or that you were unclean and shouldn't enter the temple, all those things are actually wrong. The germ theory of disease is right. And none of that's come out.
Well, there is kind of a Bible 2.0. That was the New Testament, right?
Well,
so that's not exactly right.
That is the update for the Christians,
yeah.
Except that it's worse than the first one.
Well, that's not exactly the point. The point is there was an update. So,
well,
okay, so
in the update, it's not like Jesus came along and said, hey, in Exodus 21, where I was saying you could have slaves and beat them, we got that wrong, or you got that wrong. That correction's never given. That thing about, in Leviticus where we point out that women are worth 2/3 of that of a man, we got that wrong. None of that is corrected. In fact, the reason I say it got worse, although I didn't know we were going to go down the biblical route tonight, is that if you look at Jewish tradition, when you're dead, you sleep with your fathers. There's no real clear notion of an afterlife. And then with the introduction of the New Testament, what you get is infinite torture and punishment for finite crimes, which is immoral.
All right, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, although I'd be perfectly happy to do it, if we get there. Well,
because they want us to go to questions here in a minute.
Oh, okay. So I want to address the rule system that you're putting together. Okay, so I was talking to a friend of mine who's an AI engineer. He's a very smart guy, and we've been talking about the foundations of cognition. Mm-hmm. And you know that artificial intelligence systems don't run on rules. Right.
Well, some of them do.
Well,
and certainly they run on an operating system that is full of rules.
That's actually not relevant in this case.
But that's the physical
foundation. Because they could
foundation.
Operate on all sorts of different operating systems.
Well,
but okay, so
but there's a foundation. The foundation I'm pointing to is the physical facts of the universe, and that would be roughly consistent with the hardware and the operating system that they're running on. But I'm sorry,
okay,
I interrupted.
No. I mean, that's a reasonable objection too. But look, one of the things that happened and I think this is one of the problems with the we can generate a rational system of rules that can govern our behavior approach, is that since the 1980s, people have been trying to build rule-based expert systems that can do relatively simple things. Relatively simple. They're not that simple. Like basic medical diagnosis. They don't work. Rule-based systems don't work. You can't get them to operate intelligently, which is why machine learning came about to begin with. Because whatever machine learning is doing and allowing for predictions, it doesn't seem easily decomposable to a set of listable rules and a map of their interactions. The world doesn't seem to work that way. And I would say, back to the metaphysical substrate argument, you laid forward a set of propositions, and the reason I was perhaps inappropriately torturing you about them is because there's a metaphysic under them. There's something that's driving you to put those forward as reasonable. You say, well, they're self-evidently reasonable. See, my question is...
I didn't actually say it, but okay.
Well, it's something like that, because you said, well, reasonable people could agree on these three or something similar. It seems to me that what you're saying is that there's a set of finite axioms that reasonable people could conceivably agree on, from which you could generate a rule-based moral system. Have I got that wrong? I thought that's what you said.
It's curious, because I didn't say that, but it's very close to something that I have said in the past, which is, for any given situation, there's a finite set of actions that a person could take. And some set of those actions are better than others with respect to whatever the goal is. If the goal is to continue a decent life or improve the quality of your life, some set of one or more actions that you could take in this instant produces results that are better in ways that we would agree they're better. Like throwing Sam off the stage. If we were in that situation,
Must be an unconscious fantasy going on here or something, eh? Because we keep returning to that.
And it's fun. But one of the possible actions of this set of actions would be for me to throw him off the stage. Another possible set of action would be for me to, shield him. It is clear, and you can say that I'm just saying it's self-evident, it is clear that one of those is going to be more in Sam's best interest and perhaps even more in mine than another. That's all we're saying. We're not pretending remotely that we have the answer to every possible scenario, just that we have the foundational tool set that allows us to come up with the right answers. And we do this in opposition.
Yeah, but you also think that you can do that with a set of rules.
So first
See,
of
and
all,
I actually don't think that's technically tenable. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
I don't know why it wouldn't be.
Well, you can't build expert systems, for example.
Well, you can't say that you can't because...
Well, we've tried for about 40 years with no success.
Gee, 40 years out of 13.7 billion, and we haven't cracked it yet, so it's impossible?
No. But 40 years of exponentially increasing computational power with no
Partially.
solution on the horizon except for AI.
So, and the latest AI thing, which I absolutely love because I'm a chess player, is the DeepMind AlphaZero thing that learned the entirety of what humans know about playing chess in 4 hours or so and then beat the best previous chess computer. And people are saying, it's the beginning of Skynet because now we have this sort of thinking. However, that method produced better results of letting it play itself with chess, giving it no opening book, giving it no history of chess, nothing.
Well, that's my point.
It didn't give it no rules. It gave it the rules of chess and the goal of the game.
Yes, but it didn't give it rules about how to play the game.
Correct.
Right, and that's because rule-based systems about how to play a game aren't optimal.
No.
That's why.
What happened is the AI took the rules of how to play the game and what the winning goal is, and it experimented and found the best ways to achieve that goal. And I think that's what human beings have done throughout the entirety of history. We're beings in a physical universe. We have the rules. The goal is to survive, and I would say the goal should be to thrive. Mm-hmm. And we are continually finding the best rules and the best methods. This exactly mirrors the moral system I'm talking about. The idea that there is someone on high telling the computer, don't play h4 as your first move, we threw that out because that's not the best way to find out things. Instead, we plopped the computer down just as we were plopped down in a universe when we gained consciousness and began interacting. And the computer, in the span of a few hours, discovered everything that humanity has discovered about chess. And now they are applying it to the sort of diagnostic things you were talking about. I think that is directly analogous to what the best explanations of what human beings have done. And what happens, from my perspective, is that the thinking about morality is so difficult for some that it's just easier to say, this person told me, or this God told me, or this is the case. Because having to sit down and do the sort of life inventory to figure out, hey, what's best for us? I mean, even figuring out what the goal of the game is harder for some people, and so they accept and fall into these traps of like authoritarian models of this is what your goal is. And the thing that's probably frustrated me the most, which I talked about on a college campus last year, is if the government was running around dictating to people what their job was going to be, what their future was going to be, as some regimes have done, nobody would appreciate that. Almost nobody. I'm sure somebody would be, very happy, thank you, I couldn't figure out what to do. I'm glad I'm going to be, a brain surgeon, even though I don't know anything about it. But if the government was dictating things like that, there would be revolts. There have been revolts. And yet, curiously, when people think there's a God or a divine being or some cosmic consciousness or collective consciousness that has dictated a goal for them, they celebrate it. And that contradiction has bugged me for years.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that systems of belief, let's say, including religious systems of belief, can devolve into a kind of totalitarian rigidity. I don't think you can necessarily lay that at the feet of religious belief. I mean, human systems...
No, I'm laying it all at humans.
Yeah, I mean, right, it's, okay, so it's
I
fine.
just,
It's
I
a broader
just view
phenomenon.
humans using religion
Yeah,
in that way.
yeah, yeah. So what do we do to close? Because I heard you said that we have to take questions.
Hey, we're going to take some questions.
Oh.
Because I could actually...
Sorry, I didn't mean to commandeer that. I was
No,
just
no, no,
curious
no.
about timing.
You could have just as easily said it, and I'd be happy for another 5 hours talking, but then they'd charge us a fortune, and all these people who have questions that are better than the ones I'm going to come up with. So there's microphones actually up like, yes, where that guy, oh my gosh, he's lit up where we can see him. A couple quick notes about questions. And by the way, thank you. This has been great, and
Thank you.
We'll talk
Yep.
some more. This is where I get to have a bit of fun. Couple notes about questions. For those of you who know, I do a live TV show where I can hang up on people, and if you think I can't hang up on you here, you are much mistaken. But I don't. I hope to never have to do that, and almost everybody's gone along. Questions end in a question mark, and the kind of questions we're looking for don't start with a dissertation or life story. So you can say your name if you'd like to. If you don't, that's fine, and then say who your question's for or both. And I will make a promise that I make every time and break, but I will try not to break tonight, which is I will do my best to give shorter answers so that we can get to everybody who's asking questions. But they lit you up first, sir. Thank you, and the floor is yours for a moment.
All right, thank you. I guess this question's mostly for Jordan Peterson. Just to hopefully enlighten a bit more what you mean by God, do you think that if all humanity were to cease to exist, does God still exist?
I don't think I know how to answer that. It's just, the situation is too hypothetical. I mean, I can take a crack at some of it, but so human beings are characterized by consciousness and by self-consciousness, and the latter in particular seems to be something relatively unique. There's some vague evidence for self-consciousness of lower sorts in animals, but it's not very compelling. Some of them can recognize themselves in a mirror, but our self-consciousness is accompanied by elaborated imagistic and linguistic models of ourselves and that have been elaborated over large spans of time. There are lots of elements of being that would disappear if we disappeared. Now, and it isn't even obvious to what extent that's true, right? Because I don't really understand to what degree being itself is dependent on consciousness. Like the classic materialist Enlightenment view, which I would say is basically a 19th century view, something like that, is that if all consciousness was extinguished, the material substrate of the universe would continue unchanged. But I don't really buy that as an argument, because I think that the material substrate, I think that reality is I think that reality is an interaction between what we perceive of as the material substrate and consciousness itself. And so then when you destroy consciousness, you destroy reality. And what that leaves, I don't really understand, because it doesn't have any temporality in any obvious sense. It doesn't have any size in any obvious sense without the introduction of an invisible observer. So lots vanishes without human consciousness and self-consciousness. I don't know how to answer the question, does God vanish? Because that brings us back into the same problem that I was talking about earlier, is that it's not exactly easy to understand what people are talking about when they say God. You know, because when you ask the question, would God disappear? There's an assumption there that whatever God is understandable and boxable, like a simple concept, like a chair, and that we both share the same conception. And, you know, there's endless warnings in deep religious literature against assuming that you understand what that term means, or sometimes even for using the term. So that's the best I'm going to be able to do with that question.
Thank you.
Hey there. So my question is about something that Matt said, but I'd actually like to get Dr. Peterson to address it first, if that's okay. So Matt, you said that some people are not willing to put in the work of developing sort of their own moral system, and they like turn to religion to free them from the burden of that thought. But doesn't it make sense on some level to view religion as like an archival system that holds truth? Like if we abandon that, are we not then just in a place where everyone is forced to invent their own morality for themselves throughout their life, and then like a baby born has to try to achieve that again? Like that
No.
seems like from an operative level, just an impossible system to set up that would ever get you anywhere. So I'm just wondering how you would resolve that conflict.
That was Nietzsche's critique, essentially.
Well, I'm not trying to set up the system. I think the system's already set up. So my goal is not to rid the world of religion. That's just a fortunate side effect from my goals. My goal is to have the best understanding of reality that I can, and for other people to do so as well. Now, when I talk about religion, there are things within religious histories, within religious teachings that are passed down, which are true and good and useful. And there's no reason to think that any of those things would go away if we stopped believing in a God, because they are true and good and useful whether there is a God or not. If the thing that we're worried about is, and I've asked people before, and I apologize if anybody's bothered by this, but there are people who are like, oh, if you don't believe in a God, what keeps you from running around raping and killing people? And I was like, so if you became convinced today that your belief in God was unfounded and you were forced by reason to give it up, would you run around and start doing that? And there are people who will say yes, and I hopefully, optimistically don't believe them, but we know that there are people who do that. But the truth about what is good and useful is true whether a particular religion survives or not. And we don't lose that because children aren't born with an understanding of morality. They learn that. They are educated by their parents. They are taught. They explore the world. Everybody does, in fact, go through the effort of creating and understanding their own morality. It's just that we adopt things from figures around us who show evidence that they are smarter and understand this better as a shorthand. We ride on the shoulders of giants. The curious question is, and I ask this for people ostensibly who are Christian, who believe in both a God and a devil, is how did you decide that God was the good one and the devil was the evil one? Because the model is that, well, God wrote his moral code on your heart, and that's how you tell. But if that's the case, then whether or not, if the devil had written his moral code on your heart, you would be saying he was the good one. The truth is, you are using your internal, personal, subjective assessments to determine that God is the good one, or this religion is the right one, or the First Baptist Church got it right, or the Second Baptist Church got it right, or this is the preacher we should hire. This is what we do. And I don't see much value in worrying about, oh, is it all going to go away, when it's clear it doesn't, because secular individuals are no more immoral or criminal-minded than anybody else. In fact, there may be some cases to show that we're less.
But in this society, they are no more criminally minded. Like, we have a religious foundation, right? Like, I wouldn't go around like raping and pillaging if I abandoned God, but there were societies that did when they didn't have that structure. So how do you resolve that?
I'm not saying that religious authorities haven't been useful. It's just that what I hear from some people is that we should keep this because of that particular usefulness, because they fear what will happen otherwise, because what they've seen in the past. And I don't buy that, because that boils down to saying, I may not need religion, but you people do. And that is far too arrogant for me to ever adopt as a position.
Okay,
So
I don't want to take up too much time,
quick,
but did you want to speak
I
to
have
that?
a quick comment on riding around on the shoulders of giants, which was the central theme in Matt's answer. We ride around on the shoulder of giants, and the meta-giant is God. That's a very good way of thinking about it.
Except that I can identify.
We can think about that as, I don't care about the metaphysical implications of that. I don't have to care about that at the moment. But if you look at the evolution of the idea of God, for example, and I think this is particularly true with the evolution of the idea of Christ, is that we do ride around on the shoulders of giants, And the figure of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the giant among giants. It's a meta-giant, and it's a ritual model for emulation. And the ritual model is something like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it nobly, which is a metaphysical statement in some sense that lies at the bottom of the ethic even that Matt is presenting. And so it is deeply embedded in a religious substructure. And that's the metaphorical substructure that I was talking about that necessarily underlies these self-evident axiomatic rules, which are not by any means, as you point out, self-evident in the least. There's plenty of cultures that train their young men to be absolutely barbaric monsters, right? Warriors, killers, rapists, right? Bloodthirsty right to the core. Perfectly viable mode of being, arguably speaking, from the perspective of generating a set of axiomatic rules. Why is it not better to have 10,000 women than one? There's an evolutionary question for you. Well, reasonable people wouldn't do that. Oh, yeah, right. Reasonable people. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if it's not clear, I can point to the giants. I can't point to the mega giant.
It's because it's an abstraction.
Sure, but when you hold Christ up as a particular figure, the only information that I have about Jesus comes from the Bible. And rather than going through all of it again, because there's lots of people with questions, if you go to ironchariots.org, you will find a verse-by-verse deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount where I point out that Jesus gave some good advice and some crappy advice and some questionable advice, and that's not enough. And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers. So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
one
it's
of the things
absolutely true because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular
No,
humanists.
Then,
I know
with all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is. You should read the Secular Humanist Manifestos, because what happened in Russia and communist countries was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism. None of it. And we can talk about this later, and I'll be happy to point you to this, because you can say that it was an atheist thing that went awry, but you can't call it secular humanism. It's just not there. There's no humanism in what was done there. But
I'm one of those who believes that there's no such thing as an atheistic thing or a non-religious thing. I was listening to your talk at Lafayette, Peterson, last night there, and you were talking about how all action is religious. So this conversation today, I think it's hit the same problem you hit with Rebecca Goldstein, you're going to hit with Sam Harris and June, which is I've never found a way to convey to an atheist that we all have an ideal. You can call it God, you can call it a transcendent ideal, call it an axiom, call it a presupposition. It's just very hard to communicate to them that implicitly or explicitly it's there, you're aiming for it, maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't, but it's that fundamental thing that guides your action. And my question would be, you keep, Dillahunty did a very good job of saying pragmatically, okay, fair enough, the axioms could change, maybe we try these, tries those, but there's always going to be an axiom. It's a transcendent thing because it's always changing, so we all have that. So again, the definition of God is just kind of useless, but maybe you want to explore why there is a partial definition of God that makes all actions religious, makes all ideals you're approaching for a form of God worship, whether you want to call it that or not. I hope that's coherent.
Well,
So-
Carl Jung had some very interesting comments about that. He said, psychologically, for all intents and purposes, your God is the highest value that you have. Right? It serves functionally as your deity. Now, you may not clothe it in a personified manner, although you tend to, because you tend to act it out and assume that other people should too. So it implicitly has a personified form. But if it performs all the functions of a deity, let's say, then it's importantly related in some sense to a deity. And I think that that's actually technically true if you look at how human cognitive structure works. I don't think it's escapable.
Does that make sense to you? Bill, or is that like, I don't feel I've ever heard
No,
an
see,
atheist
when you
express
said
that
you
they
have
understand
difficulty explaining this to atheists, I don't know what atheists you've been talking with, but I'm right on board, and I functionally understand and can agree with this. So secular humanism can easily be viewed as a religion. The U.S. Supreme Court has defined it in the sense of pursuit for ultimate answers to ultimate questions or things like that. But if you want to say that my God is truth or goodness or whatever thing, I'm fine with that in a poetic, even metaphorical sense. The problem is when you talk about if what you believe in fulfills all the roles of a deity, I think you're sidelining what a lot of the roles of a deity have played throughout the entirety of human history, because they're advocating, many of them, not all, most, I would say, are advocating for an actual thinking agent, supernatural, that is the creator and or sustainer of the universe. And nothing about my pursuit of truth or goodness or secular humanism fills that particular role. So already we are cherry picking the aspects of God traditionally and saying, Matt has these particular aspects that I also attribute to God. And I agree. I just don't have the other ones, and those are the ones that I want justification for.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir. You have to move up to the mic, I believe. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
So the question is for Matt. So why is the language of secular humanism, these values that you just espoused, or talked about, why is that better than religious language? And then for Press Peterson, why would religious language be better than those values?
Yeah, and I don't want to be overly pedantic about, I don't know that the language is necessarily better. The ideals of secular humanism have the goal of getting better. The foundation, if you read, and there's various versions of the Secular Humanist Manifesto, and I have disagreements with all of them, and but the nice thing is that there are revisions. Okay, this is one of the biggest benefits of a model, is how do you convince somebody that Christianity is right? Well, there's coercion, conversion, conquest. How do you
Example.
Sorry?
Example.
Okay.
That's an important one.
Okay. I'll have to think on that some more, because a lot of the things that people do that they think are exemplary or examples of Christianity, I don't think that they're in any way not necessarily tied to Christianity. Like, it's not, there's nothing a Christian could do that is good that I couldn't also do. And so the example thing doesn't work. But with secular humanism, it is through debate, discussion, data, and convincing people. It's not like we're running around saying, we're going to conquer and install this here. We're not going to make a proclamation that we have the one true right answer. The position that secular humanism takes is, as far as we can tell, we get one life. If there's more, hey, bonus, show us, we'll be convinced. It seems that we are, as human beings, as agents, stuck here trying to figure out the best way to live this life. And so we must rely on ourselves and not make appeals to supernatural agents that we can't demonstrate or that don't seem to intervene on our behalf. And if they exist, they're free to come in and step up and tell us where we're doing it wrong. But for now, we're just going to try to do the best we can with what we have to make the world a better place. That's the foundation of secular humanism, not any proclamation that we've got it right.
So I would say that the primary religious language, insofar as there is such a thing, it's something I tried to detail in Maps of Meaning, this first book I wrote. It's a very complicated book. But religious propositions are, in some sense, abstracted generalizations about what being consists of and how to act in it. It's not the same thing as a set of hypotheses about material reality. And it's partly because in the religious domain, the moral imperative is primary, whereas in the empirical domain, the factual the factual domain is primary, or the sensory domain is primary, something like that. So the question from the religious perspective is something like, how should we best construe the world if we wish to determine how to act properly within it? And the way that that language is developed, it's developed as a consequence of an evolutionary process, both biological and cultural. And it's culminated in a set of stories, essentially, that have characters. The characters basically represent something like the permanently unknowable. And so that's the mystery that surrounds us all. And that would be associated, say, with the potential of the future and the potential in you. The part of being that's transcendent, right, that constantly escapes from your theorizing. That's the unknown. It's like unexplored territory for animals. And it's a permanent part of being. So there's unexplored territory, the unknown, and there's explored territory, culture, the known, and that's this room, and that's the cultural mores that unite us well enough so that we can all sit here and be peaceful while we're discussing difficult things. So that's the landscape, the religious landscape. That's yin and yang. That's chaos and order. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's to that landscape that our brain has adapted, because the right hemisphere looks like it's roughly responsible for processing chaos and the unknown, and the left hemisphere roughly responsible for processing the known and the familiar. And that's on good evidence. If you don't want to take my word for it, you can read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which is quite masterful treatment of the neuropsychological literature. And so that's the religious domain, yin and yang, chaos and order. And it places human beings at the center of that. And the idea is that we're always confronted by what we understand and have to adapt to that, even in its tyrannical manifestation. And we're always faced with the permanent reality of the permanently incomprehensible that can burst into our life at any moment and disrupt it. That's reality. And then the religious question is, if that's reality, how do you orient yourself in relationship to those two permanent domains? And the answer to that is something like, pursue the instinct of meaning. Because it looks like meaning is the instinctive response, neuropsychologically grounded in the orienting reflex, I would say, which is a very primordial reflex to the unknown. Meaning is the response that orients us in that world. And so when we're engaged in a meaningful enterprise, it's a signal from the deepest elements of our biological being that we have the balance between what we know and makes us secure and what we don't know and have yet to explore properly sync. And that makes us secure, but not totalitarian, and engaged, but not terrified. And by staying on that midpoint of balance, that's Tao, by the way, that's the way from the Taoist perspective. By staying on that midpoint, we do what's best for us, what's best for our families, what's best for our community, and God only knows beyond that. We do all of that simultaneously, and we can tell that we're doing that. It speaks to us when we're doing that. And that's the deepest of religious instincts. And it's that capability to orient on that border between chaos and order that's exemplified in great mythological heroes like St. George, who goes out to slay the dragon, or Christ, who welcomes death, who embraces mortality and vulnerability and strives forward nonetheless. And there's nothing outside of the religious language that communicates that kind of grandeur. There's nothing that you can use to communicate to people who are in the direst of straits what's most important about life in the manner that will help set them straight and put their soul at peace. So that's the advantage of the religious language.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you both for a very interesting and revealing exchange. My question is for you, Dr. Peterson. You alluded to an important distinction between someone who would actually be an atheist and someone who merely professes to be an atheist. You implied that Matt and others are not genuinely atheists. I'm curious, why you think that. Is it just because we have sacred values, that everyone has sacred values? What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And I can't really come up with a better answer than that, because it's such a complicated question that that's the right answer. You know, I love that book. It's an amazing book, and it's a great thriller, by the way. If there are some of you, perhaps many of you, who haven't read it, you really should read it, because it might be the greatest novel ever written. I think you can make a case for that. It's unbelievably exciting once you get into it. And Raskolnikov, he plots the perfect murder. It's so interesting because Dostoevsky, the last thing Dostoevsky ever did was make a straw man out of his opponents, let's say. What Dostoevsky did in all of his great novels was make his enemies, let's say, or make each of the positions that he was trying to contend with as powerful and admirable as he possibly could. And since he was an absolutely spectacular genius, he could really do that. And so Raskolnikov plots a murder, and he murders this horrible woman, who's horrible according to everyone who knows her, who also has enslaved her rather mentally feeble niece, and who does nothing but make people miserable consciously all the time. And he does that in order to save his sister from a rather sophisticated form of prostitution, to save himself from starvation so that he can become a great lawyer and help people. Right? So Dostoevsky sets up the stage. Here is the perfect situation for a murder, and all of the rational choices point in that direction. And Raskolnikov, who's also sort of torturing himself, or sort of tortured because he's sort of hungry and not very well, not thinking very clearly, he undertakes the murder, and he gets away with it. And before he does it, he berates himself in what I would describe as the negative atheistic style. And he basically says, look, there is every rational reason to split this woman's skull with an axe. Look at all the good I would do. Look at all the well-being I would enhance. And so he does it. And then all hell breaks loose. And what Dostoevsky see, Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational, pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it. So he does. But what he finds out is that he broke an inviolable moral rule, something that spoke to his own soul, so to speak. And the rest of the book basically involves his sequential post-traumatic unraveling. And the post-traumatic issue is very interesting because one of the things you do see happening with post-traumatic stress disorder is that it very often occurs in people who watch themselves do something of great malevolence. By their own admission, I'm not projecting this onto them. They've watched themselves they've stepped outside the ancient moral code unwittingly and conducted themselves in a manner they cannot reconcile themselves to, and they are permanently broken. So there are works like that, Crime and Punishment, first and foremost, I would say, that do a lovely job of elucidating in narrative form how these self-evident moral presuppositions are necessarily nested inside this broader narrative metaphorical substrate, and that you use your rationality divorced from that metaphorical substrate at your peril. And I believe that to be the case. I think that's an accurate psychological summation.
Thank you. I'm curious if Matt has any thoughts on the matter.
You think?
I have plenty.
So it's rather surprising, and I promise you I don't mean this to be insulting, because I definitely place you considerably higher than most of the apologists that I've engaged with. But there's a common theme from the apologists, and that is, you're not really an atheist because. Now, in Dr. Peterson's case, you're not really an atheist because, in my mind, an atheist is someone who would be a murderer. And so I'm just, rather than saddle you with that, you just think you're an atheist, but really you're not. From other apologists, it's you think you're an atheist, but you're not, because God's written his moral code on your heart. Is what this is essentially, as far as I can tell, what was expressed in some way, that there's a moral foundation, a moral center that God has imbued people with, and that we all know this, or we all recognize it, or you're not really an atheist, or this is what an atheist would do. An atheist is somebody who doesn't believe there's a God. I am not convinced there's a God. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm convinced there are no gods, although that is a subset of, hey, I don't believe there's a God, and then there's a subset that is, I believe there are no gods. This is, as I've talked about previously, independent of whether or not I can be a moral being or do good things, is independent from whether or not there's awe and wonder or purpose and meaning in my life. In much the same way that, previously they wanted to kind of say, oh, this is a secular humanist, regime that was just awful. Well, it wasn't secular humanism. There were atheist fans who wrote me that were like, oh man, I can't wait till you do this conversation with Jordan. And I was like, cool. And still, I hope that we have many more conversations as well, because just saying one thing that I find irritating is never going to be enough to get rid of me. But I asked them, great, I'm not that familiar with him. What is it about him that you like, and what are the concerns? And they came back with a bunch of things. None of them said anything about agreeing with views on religion. They seemed very confused on those things. And so the good news for them is that while he thinks atheists would be murderers, he doesn't actually think you're an atheist. And that is his way of getting around acknowledging things that conflict with his worldview. I don't get to decide who is or isn't a true Christian. I didn't even get to decide that when I was a believer. I definitely don't get to do it now. So if somebody tells me they're a Christian, I'm going to have to accept that. I have a model in my head of what that means. I have a model in my head of what it means to be a Muslim, but I'm willing for them to explain to me what their model is. I know people who identify as Christian atheists. They really love the stuff that Jesus said, but they don't actually believe there's God. Thomas Jefferson famously cut out the Jefferson Bible and removed every reference to the supernatural and miracles and things like that because he really admired the teachings of it. And sure, I think you could be a cultural Christian in that if you wanted to. It's strange to me that I'm not sitting here with somebody like Ray Comfort when I'm told you're not really an atheist because you're too good to be an atheist. And this is what atheists hear all the time when they come out. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. And then atheists come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years, and they're like, you're an atheist? How can that be? You're such a good person. I've known you all this time. It's because the mindset of what people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture, right up to the height of intellectual pursuits. And it's time for that to end. And I hate to tell you, you get the last question for us.
Oh, that's so much more pressure
Sorry.
than I can handle.
They're flagging me.
Okay. You want to talk more about consciousness or more about morality?
It's your question, man.
Yeah.
Okay. Morality? Yeah, all right, fine. So,
Yeah, because that'll be quick.
yeah.
Not like consciousness would have been any quicker.
So, Matt, thanks so much for coming back to Toronto. Always great to hear you talk. Dr. Peterson, thanks for coming. Mr. Peterson, you seem sort of very willing to talk about how evolution and biological underpinnings can influence the meta-narrative down the road that, underpins our lives. But can't it also just be that evolution underpins morality without that extra step? Like, isn't it enough that the only animals that evolved are the ones that didn't die, and the only ones that evolved into a society are the ones that could live in a civilized society? Like, isn't it really clear that there are evolutionary underpinnings to morality, and that there are animals that display morality, and that it's not just humans? We're really good at it, but we're not the only ones.
Well, I would say certainly the last part of your statements are true, is that you can see what like morality in some sense is an emergent property of group interactions. It's more complicated than that because it's group interactions across time. It's more complicated than that. You see the clear underpinnings of morality in animals. Sure. You're asking, does there have to be something metaphysical beyond that?
No, I'm saying what
okay.
seems metaphysical to us is just because we're like really faulty analyzers of the real world, like the whole shadows in the grass, type 1 and, like false
Look, it's
positives, false
possible.
negatives. But like, why we wouldn't be a society if we were just naturally disposed to being immoral? Like, morality is entirely selfish. It's really good for me to be moral because my life's really good that way. And it makes me feel really good to be nice to other people. If it felt like shit to be nice to other people, I wouldn't do it.
Well, it
so
does
we evolved
sometimes.
to be moral. There's a reason it makes us feel good.
Well, okay. Look, I'm going to refer to Jung again. Jung did hypothesize that the God, he talked a lot about the God image in human beings, which was distinct from God. And you could say, let's go back to the psychedelic issue. You could say that people can have intense mystical experiences, even intense mystical experiences of a deity directly, let's say, because that does happen, without that being construed as evidence for the existence of a deity, right? The religious instinct could be built so deep into us that we can't get outside it, even if it's just a materialistic instinct.
Well,
That
some
is
of
a
us can get
possibility.
outside it. Like, I'm outside of it. and- sorry.
Let him finish because we're out of time.
Oh, well,
I wanna-
and I don't really know how to distinguish between those things. I'm not even sure that you can distinguish between them. Now, do I have anything else to say about that in closing? No, I guess I don't. I mean, I tried to lay out these views, the answer to your question, in detail in my first book. It's about 600 pages long. And it's really, 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 really hard. But it does address what you're asking. And I don't think there's a real simpler way of doing it. I didn't find one.
I only have a couple things to add before we close this out. First of all, I have no idea how long my first book's going to be, but it won't be 600 pages. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Also, I don't think I have anything specific to tag on to your question because I get the impression that we're likely on this similar pages because I think that this is the moral, cultural aspects of this are something that happen naturally. We observe in other primates senses of fairness. And the key cornerstones for morality from my perspective, while I gave an outline for a secular moral system, the foundations of that are empathy and the desire to have a good life. And the last note is one time when I was on LSD, I was staring at the wood grain on the bathroom door. I don't know why I was in the bathroom, but I was there. And from the wood grain on the bathroom door, an image formed. This is not a joke. It was a strawberry with an S on its chest, and a face and a cape. And Super Strawberry flew off that bathroom door and did a lap around my head before it smacked right into the door and became wood grain again. Coolest trip ever. And despite that, I don't think it points to the reality of Super Strawberry or his abilities. And because that was an incredibly unfair applause line to end the night with, I'd like to let Dr. Peterson give one last remark, and then we will thank you all and say goodnight. So if you have anything to add or close with on anything we've discussed this evening.
Well, I only have one thing to say. I mean, I'm very pleased, for what that's worth, that these sorts of discussions are taking place and that there's an avid public audience for them. It's like, great, you know? Yeah.
And on that note of complete agreement, Thank you guys so much for coming out. We really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you sometimes when we come back through. Cheers.
Great job. Thank you. Thank you.